Hello, I'm gonna speak about a country today. I'm gonna speak about a country today which is known from ancient times. I'm gonna speak about a country which is known for ancient things. I'm speaking of a country which is known for its fragrance of peacefulness. I'm speaking of that country which has never gone against any other country. I'm speaking of that country which has always focused on being inside. I'm speaking of that country which has never gone on any other country to acquire. I'm speaking of that country which is always focused on acquiring the inner world. I'm speaking of that country which has always kept its gates open for the world to enter. I'm speaking of that country which is always known for friendliness. I'm speaking of that country which has always kept on spreading peace. I'm speaking of that country where you find books without authors. I'm speaking of that country where you find temples, monuments without the builder's name. I'm speaking of that country where the entire art, paint, dance, music, all were designed so that it could take you back to that beautiful thing called as silence. I'm speaking of that country where each foot of this land is worshipped as God. I'm speaking of that country where every river that runs on this land is worshipped as feminine. I'm speaking of that country where the land itself is treated as mother. I'm speaking of that country where you throw anything grows so healthy. I'm speaking of that country where anyone can become wealthy. I'm speaking of that country where the foot of an elderly person is respected. I'm speaking of that country where old age is seen with wiseness. I'm speaking of that country where giving is more important than having. I'm speaking of that country which focuses on breathing is important than accumulating. I'm speaking of that country where you had people sitting inside caves, on top of mountains, and on banks of rivers and under the trees meditating. I'm speaking of that particular country which has always focused in silence. And I'm speaking of that particular world. I'm speaking of that particular country which is in. I'm speaking of that particular country which starts from in. And that country is India. Do you need any more reasons to know India? Do you need any more reasons to love India? Aren't these reasons enough to love India? Thanks. Thank you so much for loving this country.